우선 제가 여기 계신 분들 소개를 한 번씩 하겠습니다. Carl Bildt, former Prime Minister of Sweden. Let's give a big applause to him. Professor John Mearsheimer at the University of Chicago. He's also very well known in Korea. He's very hawkish view of the world and the critical view of China. Let's give a big applause to the John Mearsheimer. Okay, let me get to the Prime Minister Carl Bildt. What is the European view?
Going back a decade or a decade and a half, everything was different. Globalization was a dominating trend. In spite of difficulties, to put it mildly, 9/11, wars in the Balkans or whatever, mankind had among the best decades we ever had, both in terms of prosperity and relative peace. If you look at things now, it is very different. It is a disorienting, it is a disconcerting, it is a more dangerous world, where we see the comeback, the return of geopolitical games, and we see the return of what I like to call tribalism in different forms. That might be nationalism, or it might be tribalism of an extreme religious forms, as we see it in substantial parts of the Islamic world. If I look at it from the European point of view, which might be fairly natural for me, going back a decade and a half, we were busy taking away the importance of borders. We were busy trying to project stability to a ring of friends around us, as we believed at the time. And we find ourselves now in a geopolitical landscape where we are more surrounded by what we might call a ring of fire, with the problems of the East and the problems of the South now sort of projecting instability into the European Union in itself. It is very much a different situation. The two directions of instability are, of course, East, Russia. We have explicitly revisionist Russia. President Putin saying, in a famous speech roughly a year from now, or last year, he said that either we play with new rules or we play with no rules whatsoever, which was another way of saying I don't accept the existing rules of the game. And that was after he had launched the war in Ukraine. The conflict is still ongoing. He didn't really achieve his objectives. The conflict is stalled at the moment. It's not solved, but it's stalled at the moment. And Russia is, of course, throwing its weight around in a rather unpredictable way. But the same way as very few predicted that he would do what he did in Ukraine, very few predicted what he's now doing in the Levant in Syria. Whether that will do any good is another question. And to the south, of course, of Europe, we have, of course, the meltdown of the Levant and the meltdown of substantial parts of the Middle East. We can talk about Iraq, or we can talk about Libya, or we can talk about Yemen, or we can talk about Syria, but we are talking about a number of factors that leads to long-term fundamental issues in a part of the world that is today 400 million people, that will be roughly 50% more than that within a couple of decades. And we see that, of course, in the stream of refugees, enormous waves of things that are coming to Europe. It is, of course, just a trickle if you compare it to what is there in the region and accordingly what might happen. Add to that, of course, the rise of China. Others are going to speak more about that, where President Xi was out the other day or a week ago and said something which I'd never heard him say so explicitly before, that they want to reshape the rules of the global game. It's no longer that responsible stakeholder thing in an existing global order. It is reshaping the global order the one way or the other. And then, just to add the final thing to the complexity of the situation, we have an ongoing low-intensity conflict in cyberspace. Different actors, China is one of them, Russia is one of them, there are others. And that is influencing our societies and endangering that very critical infrastructure for our future, that is the net. So geopolitics is on the rise, but I would say cyber conflict is also on the rise. Way back, we had summit and super meetings between the Soviet Union and the United States discussing nuclear weapons. Now we have the two, not super, but cyber powers, the United States and China meeting, and they are discussing cyber issues and the cyber conflicts. So it is a vastly more complicated landscape that we are faced with.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Professor Mishima.
I'd like to thank the organizers very much for inviting me to be here today. And what I'd like to do in this brief period of time that I have is put the whole discussion of geopolitics into a broader context. Most of you, I surmise from looking around the audience, came of age during the post-Cold War period, the 25 years running from 1989, when the Cold War ended, up until roughly 2014. Those 25 years were a remarkably unusual time from the perspective of geopolitics. Remarkably unusual. We have no period in history that equals that. Now you're saying to yourself, what exactly is he talking about? Geopolitics is all about competition between great powers. And because the period from 1989 to 2014 was completely dominated by the United States, many people refer to this as the unipolar moment, there was no great power competition. There was, in effect, no geopolitics, because the United States was so powerful. The Russians, throughout most of that period, were too weak to do anything. This, of course, is why we shoved NATO expansion down their throats, right? And furthermore, the Russians actually wanted to play ball with us, as Mr. Panov made clear. And with regard to the Chinese had no interest in causing trouble with the United States or anyone else. They understood that it was best for them to sit quiet and just grow. So the United States was the dominant great power, and there was hardly any geopolitical competition. That was the first time in history that we ever saw a situation like that. All of us on the panel are old enough that we could say our formative years were spent during the Cold War. The Cold War was all about geopolitical competition. If you go back to the start of the state system in Europe, which is usually dated 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia, from 1648 up to 1989, there were two or more great powers in Europe for that entire period, and there were even great powers like Japan and China and Russia in Asia. So great power competition was part of the warp and woof of daily life. Geopolitics was part of the warp and woof of daily life. That went away, woof, in 1989. So all of you who grew up in that period are not used to understanding what geopolitics is all about. We're now going back to the old way of doing business. Geopolitics is back. One, because of the Russians, and two, because of the Chinese. There's going to be real security competition. There already is real security competition involving the Russians, the Americans, the Russians in Europe, China and Japan, China and the United States. And it's not going to be pretty, just as it wasn't pretty from 1648 to 1989. So you should thank your lucky stars, you young people in the audience, that you did come of age between 1989 and 2014. That's the good news. The bad news, it's all over, baby.
Really think that still the unipolar moment of American power, still the American century, okay? But you're saying that since starting from 2015, the American unipolar moment has been kind of descending, and there's new powers. What is your take on that one? And also for you, you are pessimistic because in this new world, maybe America may not be able to maintain this unipolar moment, right? There could be just simple law of second thermodynamics law, entropy law to say that no country can maintain that the so-called imperial position or hegemonic position for a long time. Then my second question is, what is way out of current stalemate current changes, transformation?
Yeah, let me make a couple points about the United States. I think there's only one country on the planet that can give us a run for our money, that the United States, that is, and it's China. If the Chinese economy were to slow down significantly, the United States would be more powerful relative to all its potential competitors in 2050 than it is in 2015. If you look at Japan, Germany, and Russia, which were our three principal competitors in the 20th century, all three of them are depopulating. Nobody's going to give us a run for our money except for China. So if China slows down growing, which I hope it does, we're in terrific shape, right? Second point I'd make is I'm not arguing that the United States has all of a sudden collapsed, it's all over with. Only a fool would make that kind of argument. The point is, even if you're the United States and you have an incredible amount of military power, there are limits to what you can do with that power. And if you're going to pick a fight with the Russians over Ukraine, the Russians are going to hold most of the cards, and all that military might that you have is not going to do you a lot of good in terms of getting Crimea back or in terms of influencing events in eastern Ukraine. It's just a basic fact of life. So the Russians and the Americans are at each other's throats there. And then if you look at what's happening in the Middle East, in Syria, the Russians have played their cards very skillfully there, and they've caused the Americans a lot of headaches. This is the point that I'm making. With regard to the Chinese, if they do continue to grow, are going to be militarily much more powerful than us in East Asia at some point of time. In large part because they just have so many people, and if you marry that to a great deal of wealth, this is going to be one mighty great power. Furthermore, we're taking them on 6,000 miles from the California coast. So we have huge power projection problems. They're playing in their backyard. So all of this is just to say that the United States has got all sorts of problems. Furthermore, as you know, the United States is fighting against ISIS and God knows who else in the Middle East. We're now picking fights in Eastern Europe with the Russians, and we have problems with the Chinese in Asia. So we're spread mighty thin, and there are limits to what you can do when you're mighty thin. You ask me, finally, what can we do to fix this problem? The answer is not very much, except prioritize. And we're not good at prioritizing.
Prime Minister Bildt, Sweden is known as a neutral state to us, even though it's a member of the European Union.
We stopped talking about neutrality some time ago. Yeah.
But what is your take, your analysis, or your objective view of Russian behavior? Do you think really Putin has a territorial expansion and old imperial ambition? To be very honestly, how do you see Putin's behavior?
Well, he is explicitly revisionist. You can quote him X numbers of times and saying, I don't accept the rules any longer. And I would argue we had rules. We had sort of Budapest Memorandum. I won't go into the details about Ukraine. I would say one of the fundamental rules that we had in Europe is don't invade each other. You are not allowed to alter borders with force. That is the thing that's happened with Ukraine, that he sent his army into Ukraine. He took one part of it, Crimea. He took and tried to take a bigger piece, failed, essentially. Tries to deny that he's ever been there, which everyone knows is a blatant lie, because the Russian armed forces have been there fairly massively. And that, of course, is talked about a trust deficit. Yes, there's a significant trust deficit, which has been caused by this. I've been very much part of the sort of Russian-EU relationship over the years, and we've been really trying to engage. I think you can probably make a case that the United States was disregarding Russia somewhat for some time. Europeans didn't. We were engaged with Russia intensively, economically and politically. And then a turn has happened for X numbers of reasons. And we'll see where this can end. I think we have a stalemate in Ukraine at the moment. I think Russia is acting powerfully, but from an increasingly weak position. Yes, I think the ambassador has demonstrated roughly what I said, in the sense that he said Ukraine is an artificial state, it didn't really exist before, accordingly we have the right to grab parts of it. Well, this is a way of reasoning that is first unacceptable, because this was a state that was recognized under international law by Russia, all sorts of documents. But secondly, you see, there's the fear spreading. Which other states in the region are considered artificial? Is Belarus artificial? Has Belarus existed before? Kazakhstan, is that another artificial state? Is Estonia another artificial state in the view of Russia, the one time after another? You can see that we are on a slippery slope. When Moscow certainly decides that it can decide which states are artificial, accordingly don't have the right to exist within the existing borders, and feel that it unilaterally can take military action in order to enforce its particular interpretation of history, then it's dangerous for Europe. Because Europe, don't forget that, historians are here, is a continent that has been forged by war. We've all been fighting territories. Sweden once had Finland, we fought the Danes and conquered things from them. The Danes might take it back. We had Norway, we fought Russia. They stole a piece of us and set up St. Petersburg on it. We don't intend to take it back. We recognize the borders as they are. And we think they, sorry? Yeah, well, but take my word for it for the time being. We have the fundamental fact in this fragile place on the western periphery of the Eurasian continent, with all its diversity, that peace must be built on the absolute respect for the borders. Once you start to change the borders, the risk is that the blood will start to flow again. And one of the lessons of history is unfortunately that conflict might spread around the world. That has happened twice before. And I think accordingly what happens in Europe is of course of somewhat wide interest. But could I make another point just before, not on this, but on the great power games as we discussed, the return of the great powers. One of my worries is that we don't have the return of the great powers. If you look at the situation in the Middle East, in the Levant, the great powers aren't that great any longer. The United States can't organize a peace between Israel and the Palestinians. Even if Russia and the United States were to agree tomorrow on a peace settlement in Syria, I don't see that happening, by the way, but even if it did happen, I doubt you can implement it on the ground. Because we have sort of the tribalists, we have new factors, we have new forces that are beyond the old power of the great powers. So the great powers are no longer as great as they used to be. I'm sorry to say that, Secretary, but I mean, you've seen the Iraq, Afghanistan, all of the demonstration of the limitations of great powers. And that is a thing that should also worry us in this new age.
Okay, we have only one comment from the floor. It is from the Mr. Kim Kyung-jong of Korea Chamber of Commerce, addressed to Secretary Panetta. I understand your comments, but it is South Korean destiny to be friendly with the United States and friendly with China, and I hope you would understand our position. And also, Mr. Kim strongly emphasized the role of China in denuclearizing North Korea. Those are comments.
The World Knowledge Forum